Well, when we talked about birthdays earlier, my mama didn't have a birthday last week, but she has a birthday this coming Tuesday. And they called yesterday, and they said, we were thinking about coming up, and you could buy Mama lunch for her birthday. And I said, well, if I'm going to do that, you've got to come up and hear me preach. Of course, there was silence on the phone for a minute. And I said, Mama? She goes, I'm thinking. So she had to decide if it was worth the trade-off. So we're going to start by singing Happy Birthday. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, God bless you. Happy birthday to you. I didn't tell you, Mama, but it's BYOU. As I occasionally do, and before I start, I want to remind you, like I told you 2 weeks ago, that I'm only up here by God's grace and mercy in my life. And we have a prayer that we say in one of the recovery groups I go to, take away my difficulties, that victory over them will bear witness to those I would help of thy power, love, and thy way of life. And that's the only reason I'm up here. So that said, I occasionally, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, get on the internet and argue a little bit with people. Generally politics, occasionally, often theology. And 2 weeks ago, somebody brought up my favorite theological topic to argue about, and that's hell. And when you're arguing somebody who has the very traditional view about hell, invariably they'll go to the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And you'll remember that parable, and I hope you remember it. The rich man and a beggar named Lazarus were living in the same area during the time they were alive. And they both die. During the life, the rich man wouldn't even give Lazarus a crumb from his table. And so they both pass away. And the scene we see is the rich man in a place of torment, and Lazarus up next to Abraham in heaven. And so the rich man, it says, was in torment, and he asked Abraham to send Lazarus down with just a drop of water to cool his tongue. And Abraham says, no, you've done what you've done, and everyone is getting their just rewards here. And he says, then at least send Lazarus to tell my brothers about the fate I'm in. And he said, no, they have Moses and the prophets, and they should be aware of where these conditions or where your decisions lead. And he says, well, send somebody back from the dead. Surely they'll hear that. Surely they'll hear that. They'll listen to somebody like that. And Abraham says no, even if somebody were to come back from the dead, they wouldn't listen to them. And so a lot of people go to that parable and they want to just draw out of that you do something bad in your life, you wind up burning in hell. And if you read the context of that parable, that's really not the intent of it at all. There's some good moral lessons to learn, that we need to take care of the poor, that we don't need to be selfish but generous, that the decisions we make in our life today really do have an eternal impact. But if you look at the context of that parable, it's in the discourse where Jesus, as usual, is saying something to the Pharisees. That's what a lot of his parables were about. And I've gotten to where when I argue with people online. This one occurred on Facebook with a couple of real, this is a prejudice sounding, but kind of holy roller types. And I've gotten to where I stop saying things directly to them. It's much, much better to say something and have them come to their own conclusion about it. And so it's almost like, I'm kind of rubbing my beard and I have that little grin on my face and I'm talking to someone over here But what I'm really doing is reaching over here and poking the eye of the person I'm talking to. And if you look at the context of that parable, it starts in Luke 16:19. If you go back to verse 14, it talks about the Pharisees being lovers of money and wanting to rule over all the other people. And the picture of the rich man in Hades burning, he's wearing purple, the purple robes that are just like the Pharisees. Jesus is telling them that they have the law. The Pharisees of all people knew the law. And here the rich man winds up in Hades, and Jesus is really poking them right in the eye while telling a story to someone else. It's quite occasions that he uses to say something on two different levels, so that one group will hear it and catch a lesson, but other people will hear it and catch a lesson of their own. And the parable that I'm going to speak about today is one that's very, very familiar to us. It's one that I would dare say, of all the parables that Jesus told, Christians know it and have taken it to heart. And there's a very strong message that is meant for us. But there's another message that was meant at the time for the Pharisees. And it becomes a message for us today as people who have been in the church for a while and need to look at some of the stuff in their own life. So I'm going to read a little of it right now. It's in Luke chapter 15, verse 11. Then he said, a certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that fall to me. So he divided to them his livelihood. And not many days later, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal living. But when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in the land, and he began to be in want. Then he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into the fields to feed swine. And he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to the servants, Bring out the best robe, and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring the fatted calf here and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to be merry. As I mentioned, that's a parable that hits all of us in the heart at some point in our lives. I know in my life that parable has meant so much time after time after time. It's been, when I have occasion to be, as the parable figuratively said, being even in the point where I'm in the pigsty feeding swine, and I make that decision to come back to God. There were times in my life where I thought that God that was waiting on me was very stern, very disciplinary, didn't want to hear me say I'm sorry. He just wanted to remind me of what I had done wrong. But what that parable started to show me was that wasn't God at all. That God was the Father who would be there standing to forgive you time and time again. It was almost like I was in some kind of movie and I was rehearsing my